Hello and welcome to Alumni University. I'm Ashley Agron, the Director of Constituent Engagement at Illinois Tech, and we're so happy you can all join us this evening. Before we get started, just a few reminders that we will be recording this presentation, and feel free to ask any questions in the chat box or the Q&A that's at the bottom. We'll be mindful to try to get all of your questions answered at the conclusion of Dr. Power's presentation. To introduce our presenter this evening, we have Margaret Power, Ph.D., who is an Illinois Tech Professor Emeritus of History and Director of the Dual Admissions Honors Law Program. Dr. Power has a BA from Georgetown University, a MA from San Francisco State, and a PhD from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research interests include focuses on Latin America, specifically Chile and Puerto Rico, as well as women and gender. Her earlier work explored why a large number of Chilean women opposed the socialist government of Salvador Allende and supported the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. She has also explored various expressions of the global and transnational right. This evening, Margaret will be discussing her upcoming book, Solidarity Across the Americas, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party and Anti-imperialism. With that, I will turn it over to Margaret to go ahead and get us started.
Great. Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Ashley, and welcome to everybody. I don't know who's in the audience, so I don't know if I know anybody or not, but a special hi to anybody I might know. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to work through this as a PowerPoint. This is basically, is it on the screen right? Can everybody see okay, or are there any problems?
We can see your PowerPoint.
Okay, great. So this is just the title slide. This is to the left is the cover of my book. It's going to be coming out in probably April 2023. These things take so long. I finished August a year ago, but whatever. It's I want to explain a bit about why I wrote the book. And actually, I wrote the book after conversations with students at Illinois Tech, because I would routinely ask them, so do Puerto Ricans need a visa to come to the United States? And roughly 50, 60, maybe 70% either said, yes, they do, or they weren't sure about it. But of course, Puerto Ricans do not need a visa to come to the United States because Puerto Ricans are US citizens, but that's not something that was sort of up there in people's consciousness. Interestingly enough, after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico 5 years ago, not the most recent Fiona, but 5 years ago, a survey was done, and something like 60% of people in this country did not know Puerto Ricans were US citizens. So I realized that there was a lot of lack of understanding or knowledge about Puerto Rico. So I thought, so, okay, I want to write a book about Puerto Rico, but what about Puerto Rico? And what I decided to do, sort of actually in correlation with that, is most people don't know that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. They think, we still have a colony? Yeah, we still have a colony. It's Puerto Rico. And then possibly people could consider someplace like Guam also a colony of the United States. So I thought, instead of just focusing on a history of Puerto Rico and the United States, what I'm going to do is focus on a group, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, that supported independence for Puerto Rico. And the picture that you see to the left, which is the cover of the book, at the top are two members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. If you can see, this woman is Lolita Lebron, and this is Rafael Cansan Miranda, and this took place, the event, they're being arrested by the Washington, D.C. police on March 1st, 1954, after they went into the U.S. Congress, fired shots. She fired up at the cupola. There were two other men as well. They fired down at the congressman. Luckily, nobody was killed. A few people were 5 were wounded, but they all survived. And they did it to call attention to the fact that Puerto Rico was a colony. So I wanted to have that, but I wanted to have that in the context of their work across the Americas. So what you see in the background is a map that includes parts of Central America, parts of the Caribbean, parts of northern northern South America. And the main question that I look at is what does the title mean? Sort of solidarity across America. Why was there so much solidarity, which actually has not been a topic that has been explored at all. So basically, the question that I'm asking and answering in the book, why was there such an outpouring of solidarity in Latin America, is it because many Latin American individuals or governments or organizations believe that Puerto Rico was a part of Latin America and should not be part of the United States. So they supported independence. They opposed colonialism and believed that Puerto Rico had the right to be a free, sovereign nation. They also opposed interference in their own countries, and as a result felt sympathetic to Puerto Rico because there has been a very long history, especially beginning, say, in the 1840s, of U.S. intervention, U.S. invasion throughout Latin America. If we think of the northern half of Mexico, which is now the U.S. Southwest, well, it used to be the northern half of Mexico. So a lot of people throughout Latin America thought, we don't want the United States coming in and taking over our country. So they felt a lot of sympathy for Puerto Rico. And Latin Americans in general wanted a region free of foreign control, made up of truly independent nations. So I'm going to give a bit of background about Puerto Rico, which you may be very familiar with. I'm sorry if that's the case, but you may not be, and therefore, hopefully, you'll learn more about it. So I'm going to begin by just situating us. So here's Puerto Rico. It's in the eastern end of the Caribbean. Right next to it is the Dominican Republic, and then Haiti, and then further west is Cuba. This is a drawing of July 5th, 1898, when the US military landed in Guanica in Puerto Rico and basically began the invasion of Puerto Rico, the ultimately successful invasion of Puerto Rico. And one of the big questions that occurred was, so what's going to happen to the people of Puerto Rico? What's going to happen to the people of Cuba? What's going to happen to the people of the Philippines? All three of them were taken over by the United States at that point in the so-called Spanish-American War. And I think to understand why it was such an issue has to do with a lot of the ideas about the conquered peoples that existed in the United States at that point in time, which takes us to the next slide. And I'm just going to pause a moment and walk through this slide a bit. This is a picture, as you see, Uncle Sam looking sort of stern, strict, larger than anybody else in the entire room. These are the 4 recently acquired colonies: Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And as you can see, what we have here is they're portrayed, first of all, they're all portrayed as Black. They're portrayed as basically savages. Although they're dressed in US clothing, they're also portrayed as children. So there was this whole idea of the conquered peoples of these places are children. They need the stern tutelage of Uncle Sam with his stick, who, should they misbehave, will be only too willing to punish them. And they're up here in the front seat. In the back seat, in the back rows, if you look, are a group of very nicely dressed white children who are behaving very well, from Texas, California. Okay, all these kids their hair is neatly combed, they're in neat dresses, they're reading, they're behaving the way they should. And just to sort of get a sense of what else was going on, here's a Native American sitting all by himself in the corner. As you can see, his book is upside down. He's sort of just too stupid to even know how to read. Over here is a Black man who, of course, is a laborer cleaning the windows. And outside is a little Chinese boy who's so outside, he's not even allowed into the school. All of this is adding up to the idea that no, these the peoples from these countries should not be citizens. They're not ready to be citizens of the United States. They need to wait and be educated by Uncle Sam, i.e. by the United States. And it's sort of, I think this cartoon of this is not an atypical cartoon. There were many, many like them at the time. So it sort of talks about the mentality that was existing in the United States at that time. Another quick question then would be, so why did the United States want Puerto Rico? And one key reason has to do with the strategic location of Puerto Rico. Here's Puerto Rico again. Again, this is called the Mona Passage. And the Mona Passage was one of the key entry and exit points to the Caribbean. So if you go into the Caribbean, you're not only going to the islands, you're also going to Central America, Mexico. Here's the southern part of the United States. And if you go down further, of course, there would be northern South America. So for the United States to have control over the Mona Passage meant that the United States could have a lot of control over who goes in and who comes out of Puerto Rico, which was a strategic importance especially in the early 1900s. And the reason it mattered so much is that most of the world's business, most of the world's commerce, most of the world's resources, and certainly the militaries of the world were transported on ships. So the waterways of the world were basically the key factors, the key arteries that determine the domination of the world. Okay. Puerto Rico is also a key fueling station because so much of the business of the world was conducted on ships, both the merchant marine and the Navy. Then the United States needed a fueling station where their ships could stop, get fuel to continue on. Puerto Rico also became a site for US military bases. So these are all military bases that dotted the island. And what's interesting, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but the base over here, Roosevelt Roads, was so huge that during World War II, the British Navy was concerned that if the Nazis are able to actually conquer England and the British Navy has to leave, then they would find shelter here in Roosevelt Roads. And from Roosevelt Roads was also a key site, again, during World War II, where the US Navy could guard against German submarines, which were all throughout the Caribbean. So Puerto Rico had crucial military importance, both for control of the southern part of the United States, but also, again, Central America, South America, Mexico. And just to give an example, it also was central to the control of the Panama Canal. And I think many of us just sort of at this point take for granted the Panama Canal, but I just thought this slide would be interesting. Prior to the construction of the Panama Canal, ships would go from New York City down through at the very tip of South America, then say up to San Francisco. It was 20,900 kilometers. Once they went through here, 8,370 kilometers, completely shortened the trip. And down here at the tip was one of the most dangerous sailing areas in the entire world on top of it. So Panama was also, Puerto Rico is also central to control the Panama Canal. The other thing that the United States got from Puerto Rico was control over the sugar industry. And many of us probably associate the sugar industry, especially with Cuba, but sugar was also, or became, a prime agricultural product in Puerto Rico under the control of the United States. And the United States took over or built or invested in a lot of the processing plants. So this is a processing plant for the sugar that was being produced in Puerto Rico during this period of time, which meant that basically most of the sugar industry became controlled by US investors operating especially out of New York City. What that also meant was that land that Puerto Rican farmers had farmed began to be taken over by the sugar industry because the sugar industry was so incredibly profitable. So Puerto Ricans who had owned land lost their land and then had to go work as sugarcane workers in very difficult conditions and for very little pay. And here's an example of Puerto Ricans working in the sugarcane industry. Another aspect of the early years of US colonialism was the concept of Americanization. And this goes back to the slide I showed about Uncle Sam, that these little kids, i.e. Puerto Ricans, Philippines, Hawaiians, and Cubans, just aren't ready to be US citizens. They have to be educated. So the US government passed laws saying that all the classes were to be taught in English. This caused a tremendous amount of discontent because Puerto Ricans spoke and actually speak Spanish. So that suddenly the US government was coming and say all the classes have to be taught in English. In 1917, Puerto Ricans were made US citizens. Interestingly enough, Puerto Ricans had no say whatsoever into whether or not they wanted to become US citizens. The decision, as in fact, every decision that took place in Puerto Rico of consequence was made in Washington, DC, and then imposed on Puerto Ricans. Interestingly enough, Puerto Ricans were made citizens, but they did not have voting rights, meaning, and this is still true today, if you are a Puerto Rican who lives in Puerto Rico, you're a citizen, you are a full citizen, but you have no right to vote for president, no right to vote for senator, no right to vote for Congress. If, however, you're Puerto Rican and you move to the United States, then you can vote. But if you're Puerto Rican and live there, you can't vote. And this is, there's no real translation, but the cabotage law, which means nothing, but the ley de cabotaje, which basically is the law that anything that goes into Puerto Rico has to go in on ships built in the United States. The Navy, the crew has to be US, and you have to, that's the only place you can get products into Puerto Rico. So today, for example, 85% of Puerto Rican food is imported. And the only way it can get into Puerto Rico is if it goes on US ships, meaning if, for example, they could get the food they need from the Dominican Republic, which is right next door, they would not be allowed to do it. What that means is prices for food are so much higher in Puerto Rico than, say, even in the United States. Once Puerto Ricans became citizens, they were drafted to fight in the US military. But keeping in mind, so they're drafted to fight in the US military, but they still cannot vote for any federal official. In response, this organization, the Puerto Rican Nationalists, no parentheses, but the Nationalist Party formed in 1922, and they formed especially to oppose the idea of Americanization. Basically, they said, we're Puerto Ricans, we want to stay Puerto Rican, we want to have our culture, we want to speak Spanish, we want to keep what it means to be Puerto Rican. And so for this early period, this was basically, it was basically a male organization, at least, and all the leadership was men, and that was not atypical. That was very typical for political organizations throughout I don't know, much of the world at the time. This is a picture of the party Congress. As you can see, it's all men, and you think but what you notice is Puerto Rican flags, and I think it's interesting to see. It's a very mixed group racially, and also you can see how all the men are completely dressed up, which is how you behaved in politics. You dressed up nicely. From the beginning, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party believed that it was really important to build solidarity and connections throughout Latin America, and they did so for three reasons. One, they wanted Puerto Ricans to feel themselves to be part of Latin America. All of Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, all these countries in Central America, Mexico, from Venezuela on down, not Brazil, not Guyana, not Suriname, not French, but these were all French colonies. So they said, look, our culture, our heritage is much more tied into the nations that were former Spanish colonies than to the United States. We're not Anglo-Saxon, we're not Protestant. We trace our background to Spain, not to England. We speak Spanish, we're Catholic. And that was very important to many Puerto Ricans. And it's something that the Nationalist Party emphasized to try and draw differences between Puerto Ricans and the United States, so that people would feel, wait, we're not part of that, of the United States. The Puerto Rico also understood, as you can see, Puerto Rico is, by any estimation, a small place. So they understood that in order to be able to obtain independence, they needed the solidarity and support of the rest of Latin America, both material support and political support. So they needed to build those relations. So from 1927 to 1930, the Pedro Albizu Campos, who was the vice president of the Nationalist Party and later became the president of the Nationalist Party, went on a tour. He went first from Puerto Rico to the Dominican Republic, then to Haiti. He said Haiti was still under military occupation when he got there. So he sort of took a boat, he took a ship, he was rowed in to meet with people, met with them for 6 hours, and then rowed back out to the main ship and they left. Then same in Cuba. The only place things were not going well was in Mexico, because the president at that point was engaged in basically a civil war. It was during the time of the Mexican Revolution, and a lot of Catholics in Mexico felt that the Mexican Revolution was anti-clerical or anti the Catholic Church, and Pedro Albizu Campos was very, very Catholic. And so there was a sense of, from the part of the Mexican government, that the last thing we want to do is build ties with somebody who's very Catholic. So that didn't work out so well. So then went back to Havana, Cuba, then down to Lima, stayed there, then came back here, stopped in Caracas, met with people who were opposed to the dictator at the time, and then back to Puerto Rico. And so the whole voyage was an example of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party prioritizing its relationships with Latin Americans, and Latin Americans coming to learn more about Puerto Rico, about the situation in Puerto Rico, and feeling a degree of solidarity with Puerto Rico. And Albizu Campos, in turn, then learned a lot about Latin America. The key ideas of the Puerto Rican nationalists were that Spain had no right to cede Puerto Rico to the United States, meaning after the war, people in Cuba, the Philippines, and some people in Puerto Rico had been fighting to end Spanish colonialism. Spain basically was defeated. The United States defeated Spain, and so the war ended by the Treaty of Paris. However, prior to the war beginning in 1898, the Spanish government had granted Puerto Rico autonomy. So the argument of the Nationalist Party was, if we're autonomous, then Spain cannot decide our fate. Therefore, the very idea that Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the United States was illegal from the get-go. So therefore, the United States had no right to control Puerto Rico. Again, Puerto Rico is not part of the United States, it's part of Latin America, and that Puerto Ricans should withdraw from all US institutions, including the military. Puerto Ricans have the right to use armed struggle to achieve independence, and Puerto Rico should be a sovereign republic. So these are some of the basic ideas of the Nationalist Party. In the 1930s, politics in Puerto Rico really changed. Two hurricanes hit Puerto Rico, and up into Hurricane Maria in 1917, this was one of the hardest, the strongest hurricanes. It had a devastating effect on the coffee industry. And then 1930s, the Depression hit. So on the one hand, we have this incredibly high level of unemployment, and people in Puerto Rico are thinking, wait, all the things that the United States promised us aren't exactly happening. We're poor, we're very poor, we're not getting rich, there's unemployment, there's starvation. As a result, support for the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party began to increase. And here's a picture of Pedro Albizu Campos. And he was elected president of the Nationalist Party in 1930 after he comes back from his trip. A word on him, he was of, his father was Basque from the northern part of Spain. His mother was an Afro-Puerto Rican. Her mother had been a slave, so he was a mixed race Puerto Rican. He was also the very first Puerto Rican to get his law degree from Harvard University. So he was this highly articulate, educated individual. Okay, as the support for the Nationalist Party increased during the 1930s, the United States government said, okay, we are going to appoint two key figures to run Puerto Rico. Every single figure that ran Puerto Rico, the governor, the head of the police, let's just say everybody of importance was nominated and named and put into place by Washington, D.C. Again, Puerto Ricans had absolutely no say whatsoever on, not only did they have no say on the federal level, they didn't have any say on the local level. So the governor was an ex-military guy, Blanton Winship. The head of the Puerto Rican police was Elijah Root, also the head of, also a former military guy. So their idea was the Nationalists are getting too strong. What we have to do is repress them. In a sense, they had this military attitude that if you have a danger, if you have an enemy, then use military force against them. So what this is a march that the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party held on Palm Sunday in 1937 in the southern town of Ponce, Puerto Rico, which actually is, if anyone is following the news, where President and Jill Biden were in Ponce just yesterday. It was one of the places hardest hit by the most recent hurricane, Fiona. The Puerto Rican Nationalist Party had gotten a permit for the march. They were ready to set off when the governor the head of the police gave the order, do not let them march. So they said, if you march, we're going to shoot. The Nationalists basically said, in a sense, you cannot tell us not to march. So they started marching. The Puerto Rican police opened fire and killed 19 people, including Nationalists, young people, people who were just passerbys or people who were watching the parade, and wounded something like 180 people. This became known as the Ponce Massacre. And not content with just shooting people to try and terrorize people so they wouldn't support the Nationalist Party, they also arrested the leadership of the party. And this is Pedro Albizu Campos again. This was the Secretary General of the party, Juan Antonio Correger. And they tried them in a very, let me say, fixed jury, and sent them to exile in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in Georgia, meaning that they didn't even allow them to stay in Puerto Rico. They kicked them out and sent them there. Okay, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but to the 1950s, which is a big jump, but we all have limited time. So in the 1950s, World War II is ended, and the big question becomes, at this point, sort of the Cold War has begun, and there's a contest between the United States and the Soviet Union for world control or world domination. The United States said that we're on the side of, we're not on the side of totalitarian governments, we're on the side of democracy, we're on the side of national liberation, say when all these countries in Asia and Africa that have been European colonies successfully fought for and obtained their independence. And the United Nations had already started. So a lot of countries around the world said, wait a minute, wait, you say you support national liberation, you say you don't support colonialism, but you have a colony. It's called Puerto Rico, and it's right there in the Caribbean. So the United States, in conjunction with Puerto Rican figures, who became the governor, Luis Muñoz Marin, basically said, well, we've got to do something about it. So they said, let's change the status of Puerto Rico. So a vote was held on rewriting the Constitution, and the new Constitution was voted on, and there was a vote held in which the status of Puerto Rico became what it is to this day. It's called a free associated state. Now, if any of you remember history or the Constitution, which I don't remember the Constitution all that well, but I do know this. There's no such thing in the Constitution called a free associated state. You're either a state or you're not a state. So this was a sort of fictitious nomenclature that was developed in order to disguise the fact that Puerto Rico was still a US colony. In response, the Nationalist Party said, we've got to protest this. We've got to prevent this change from happening. So in 1950, they rose up and attacked the governor's mansion here in San Juan, and then all these little towns throughout Puerto Rico. And the only place that the uprising was at all successful was in Jayuya. So I'll go, these are all very, very mountainous towns up here, Utuado, Jayuya. Okay, and the leader of the attack in Jayuya was a woman named Blanca Canales. And this is her, you can't help but look at her and think she seems a little matronly. You would not exactly go look at her and say, oh, she was the leader of the military attack, but nonetheless she was. And she was arrested. And not only was she arrested, something like 1,000 people were arrested throughout Puerto Rico. And here are pictures of people being arrested or terrorized. And I want to go back for a moment to Jayuya again. In order to put down the revolt in Puerto Rico, the US National Guard sent planes that strafed Jayuya and then sent in the National Guard. And I think it's interesting to point out, for those of you who have been following recent sort of news about history, there are only 2 cities in the United States that the US military has attacked from the air. One of them is Jayuya. The other is Tulsa, Oklahoma, or the black section of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I think it's really significant that the 2 places where the US military strafed or bombed cities from the air are both places where they're basically not white people, but people of color in them. Okay, so over 1,000 people were arrested. The revolt was put down. Then, going back to what I started with at the very beginning, Puerto Rico became a free associated state, but these 4 Puerto Ricans, I showed on the cover of the book, we saw at the very beginning, this woman, Lolita Lebron, this man, Rafael Cancel Miranda, and then these 2 men also, Irving Flores and Andres Figueroa Cordero, are the ones who attacked the US Congress. And what's interesting again is that the military commander was a woman, Lolita Lebron, and often we don't think of organizations appointing women to be the military commander, but in both cases they were. They were arrested, they were convicted, they were put in jail from 1954 and then released in 1979 when President Jimmy Carter released them because there was so much world pressure calling for their release. So the next, the final part is just talking a little bit about solidarity. And I'm just going to say some of the figures that supported independence for the Nationalist Party and the prisoners. This woman is Gabriela Mistral. This is Pablo Neruda. And they were both Chilean Nobel Prize winners for literature. They were both very much in support of the Nationalist Party. when the leadership of the Nationalist Party was in jail in Atlanta, Gabriela Mistral, who was a Nobel Prize winner, went to Atlanta to try and visit them, but the prison authorities wouldn't even let her into the prison. Pablo Neruda was probably one of the most, if not, well, let's say one of the most famous poets from Latin America. And he also was very much in solidarity with them. Solidarity also occurred within the United States. Pearl Buck, who might not be an author who's that well known, but she wrote The Good Earth. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature as well. Okay, it's not just Nobel people who win Nobel Prizes for literature that, that support the Nationalists, but she certainly did. And she helped to form an organization called Americans for Puerto Rican Independence. And she was very active in trying to get the political prisoners out of jail. And this is Norman Mailer, who may or may not be familiar. Again, we're talking about the 1950s. He was the author of The Naked and the Dead. He was the winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And he also was active in support of the nationalist political prisoners. And then, of course, other figures such as Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were also very prominent supporters. And there were declarations. I just want to go through. This is just a small segment. So the Argentine parliament, the Ecuadorian parliament, the presidents Arevalo and Arbenz of Guatemala, Chilean senators and other elected officials, Mexican labor leaders, US-based pacifists, and the presidents of Venezuela. And this is just a small fraction of the different individuals, organizations, groups throughout Latin America that supported the Nationalist Party and the release of the nationalist prisoners. And so, in a sense, the whole point of the book was saying to take a new look at how people throughout the Americas understood and related to Puerto Rico and the Nationalist Party from the 1920s to the 1950s. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And I would love to have any questions. I know I went through it kind of fast, so if you have any questions about anything whatsoever, as I always say to my students, there is no question that is not a welcome question. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. Okay. Okay, I'm back.
Thank you so much, Margaret. This was very informative. I love the topic and discussion. I apologize again for the technical difficulties that we had mid-presentation, but you picked up beautifully and flawlessly to continue on right where we left off. I will check the chat and the Q&A. I don't see that anyone has posted any questions as of yet. I will ask a question though, if you don't mind. What is your earliest memory of where your interest sparked to research Puerto Rico and Latin American countries? What really drove you to focus that on your research, do you think?
Well, I'll say my earliest interest, or the first time I ever remember anything about Puerto Rico was I grew up in the Episcopalian church. So the Episcopalian minister had a play of sorts about Puerto Rico. And I grew up in Southwest Pennsylvania, a small town, very small town. And so they had something about Puerto Rico, and I think some Puerto Ricans were talking. And I remember asking a question about, or somebody asked a question about how hot it was in Puerto Rico. And someone said, it's so hot in Puerto Rico that you can fry eggs in a skillet on the sidewalk. That was my first memory of Puerto Rico. But, but really, how I really got interested in Puerto Rico was actually, I was first interested in Chile because I was interested in the popular unity government of Salvador Allende, the one that was overthrown in a military dictatorship on September 11th, 1973. And I thought the idea was just so interesting about sort of the peaceful road to socialism. I thought, what is that about? And then I took my junior year abroad in France. this is a little complicated, but I was visiting my sister who was living in Germany, and I thought, oh, why don't I go to East Berlin? Like, ooh, go through Checkpoint Charlie. It was still when it was under the control of the Communist Party. And I didn't speak German, but I went with my other sister, and we happened to be there the day after the military coup, and there was the overthrow of the Allende government. And I sort of said, what's going on? What's going on? Because all these people were demonstrating and protesting the coup. And someone said, oh, there was an overthrow of Allende in Chile. And so that's what got me interested. Then I was a French major, supposedly, but then I came back to university, and all I wanted to do was study Spanish. And then after I graduated from college, my sister and I flew to Puerto Rico, took a boat to Venezuela, and then took multiple buses from Venezuela down through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and lived in Chile during the military dictatorship, which was really quite an experience.
Thank you for sharing. We do have a question in the Q&A. Cindy is asking, what caused them to later push for statehood?
Well, there have been three political tendencies in Puerto Rico. One is supports statehood. One supports the continuation of the free associated state, and one supports independence. At different points, the support for independence has been larger, say in the 1950s, and then again in the 1970s. There have been a series of different referendums or plebiscites. What do you support? And in the most recent one, people were given different choices, but what got the largest vote, basically, everybody supported independence, and everybody who supported the continuation of the current status did not vote in the most recent election. So it appears as if statehood won, but in fact, the majority of the people didn't vote. And then in the previous one, the majority of the people had voted none of the above. And I think it's all sort of, it's this way of saying, well, whatever we vote, it doesn't matter, because Washington's going to decide, and Washington will decide in Washington's interests. So I think that's why it's sort of complicated. So it appears there's statehood. And so, for example, there's the current governor supports statehood, but then other people have elected don't support statehood. So there's not a uniform opinion that you can really push for. But why, for example, right now, the Democratic Party is pushing for statehood, for example, to some sectors in the Puerto Rican Democratic Party are, because they figure if Puerto Rico comes in, it'll come in with senators and congressmen, and they'll support the Democratic Party the same way as say Washington D.C. If Washington D.C. comes in, that are clear votes for the Democratic Party. But that also means that the Republican Party is probably opposing statehood for Puerto Rico, because they think if Puerto Rico comes in, that'll mean votes for the Democratic Party. So we don't want the votes and offices, positions for the Democratic Party. So that's another reason Puerto Ricans think, well, we're not really going to decide anyhow. They're going to decide. Did that answer your question, Cindy?
I think it answered the question. I don't see Cindy
Okay.
adding a response or a follow-up question. And currently there aren't any other questions in the chat or the Q&A.
Okay.
We still have 10 more minutes. If anyone has a question that they'd like to type in, feel free. We'll just give it another minute or so. I'd like to again thank everybody for attending this event. And to Dr. Power, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your expertise.
Well, could I ask, when students don't talk, I always just say, okay, I'll just ask you a question. I guess I'd like to know what anybody out there thinks about Puerto Rico. What do you think should happen, or what do you feel that you learned from what I said, or are there things you disagree with and would like to have a different point of view? So Dennis raised a hand.
Dennis raised a hand, so I'm going to allow him to unmute and go ahead and ask a question. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Well, I just wondered what you think about the term banana republic in terms of having Latin Americans control everything.
Well, Banana Republic started specifically in terms of Central America, as you probably know, because the U.S. banana companies basically took over the land of much of Central America. So, for example, United Fruit, Guatemala is a perfect example. United Fruit basically controlled not only most of the land in Puerto Rico, in Guatemala, they built the ports where the bananas were shipped out. They built the railroads, and the railroads went from the port in Guatemala to the banana plantations, not to the cities in there. And so the concept of a banana republic is the idea that the government is more or less of a show government, because the real force is the United States. So when the government in Guatemala in 1954 tried to nationalize the United Fruit holdings, the CIA and the US government overthrew the government in Guatemala and basically, they said, oh, they're communists, and overthrew them. So I think the term banana republic, to me, implies the idea that it's US companies that own all the resources, the bananas in Central America. And if the governments do something they don't like, they can get the CIA and the US military. They could get the CIA and the US military to overthrow them, so they would do US bidding. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know. There's still not exactly. It seems like most of the problems with the people coming north are because of the government. So you think that's still true, or that's?
I do. I think there's this. I think a lot of the current wave of immigration from Central American nations, I think is what you're talking about, has to do with the economic problems that are taking place in the countries. I think a lot of people want to escape the idea that if I'm a kid or I have children, that they will be incorporated into the gangs. But what's important to note is that when the major gang in El Salvador, Mara Salvatrucha, got started not in El Salvador, but in Los Angeles. And it was made up of kids who fled the Civil War in El Salvador in the 1980s, went to Los Angeles. Their parents worked basically two, 3 jobs to support them. So these kids were kind of bereft of any other real support. So they formed gangs with each other. And then in the 1990s, the US deported them back to El Salvador. Most of these kids, many didn't speak Spanish. They didn't have any connections there. So they brought the gangs with them. And then the gangs got all involved in the drugs. And it's just sort of proliferated throughout the rest of Central America and into Mexico. So I think it's a very complicated situation. But there's, in a sense, it's circular too, that they fled the Civil War that the United States was waging against the people in El Salvador. So it's sort of like, well, had there not been a civil war and the people had been able to stay there, they wouldn't have fled to the United States in the first place. So I think that when there have been governments in Latin America that have attempted to build better economic realities for their people, then most unfortunately the United States has usually stepped in and overthrown them. And then I think that produces a lot of chaos and dissatisfaction.
I was wondering if you have any comment about Walker. I think there was somebody who tried to set up a government.
He did in
Nicaragua.
Yeah. He did. He went in, he defeated the opposition in Nicaragua. He took over control of Nicaragua in 1850s, I think it was, William Walker, and he declared himself president. And although Latin America had, not Brazil, but the other parts of Latin America had outlawed slavery, he reimposed slavery in Nicaragua. He was a Southern slave owner, so he wanted to reimpose slavery in Nicaragua. So, and then he was defeated by when Central Americans united and drove him out and killed him. So I think that he was, let's say, a most unsavory character.
Okay, well, thanks for your comments.
Thanks for those great questions, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis. We do have another question in the Q&A. Brian would like to know if the US taking Puerto Rico from Spain was illegal, then does that presume that Puerto Rico becoming an independent country was the preferred outcome for the people of Puerto Rico at the time? Do more people in Puerto Rico today like the idea of a US statehood or complete independence?
At the time, most people actually welcomed the United States. So there's what was legal. That was so when I said that's what Pedro Albizu Campos said, that I don't know if there's ever been any court of law that said yes, it was illegal. That I was more trying to say what were the ideas or mentality of the nationalists. So I could not tell you whether he was right in saying that. All I can say is this is what they did think. When the US first went in, they thought, okay, look, Spain has just treated us like dirt. The United States is the country of progress. It's the country of modernization. It's the country of wealth. They'll bring that to Puerto Rico. So initially, the majority of the population welcomed the United States coming into Puerto Rico. But by the 1920s, and even more by the 1930s, they realized the things we had hoped for, the things that in fact the United States promised, did not happen, which is why we're so poor. And I think you can look at Puerto Rico now and say, Puerto Rico is a very, very poor place. Something like 40%, I think it's probably one of the highest, 40% of Puerto Ricans live under the poverty line. That to me is an example of a failure, not an example of a success. And I think so much so that there are now more Puerto Ricans living in the United States than there are in Puerto Rico because they can't support themselves. So I think after Hurricane Maria, when the response of the US government, if anybody remembers, President Trump went and threw paper towels at people. These are people who had no electricity, no running water. They were devastated, and to throw paper towels at people was it was so insulting to many people. I think they thought, we can't rely on the United States. We'll do it ourselves. Of course, other people thought, if we were a state, they wouldn't treat us this way. They'd have to treat us better. So I think there's just a lot of back and forth. And I think after you've been a colony for, let me do that, 124 years, then you get this sense of dependency. It's sort of like, well, we couldn't exist without the United States. How could we survive without the United States? If you go into Puerto Rico, there's almost a Walgreens on every single corner. Okay, I exaggerate, but to think if all the food that comes into Puerto Rico, and it's 85% of the food, comes through the United States, you think, well, how could we survive without the United States? So it creates this attitude or mentality of dependency, and you think we can't possibly exist. So I don't know right now exactly what people are thinking or what they want or how they would go or what statehood would look like or what independence would look like. It's there. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer.
Thank you, Margaret, for answering Brian's question. We are just at time now. It's 6:30, so we've made it through our hour. I thank you again so much for your time this evening. If anyone else has any questions, you can write it in the chat and we'll try to answer it, but just to be mindful of Margaret's time, we are at 6:30. Again, thank you everyone for joining us and look forward to the next Alumni University. We will plan to have another faculty presentation in November and then continuing the series in spring 2023. But yeah, thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank
it was
you.
an absolute pleasure.
Same here. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.